Yeah. The Mac is back with another video. Hello, the initiated. Hello, Save and Sound. My name is Marcus Junikala, and today we're having a look at the soundtrack for Breachway. Now, Breachway is a deck building space roguelike. So you have a spaceship, you have certain equipment on that spaceship, that makes your deck of cards, and the deck of cards is what you use in space combat to do the pew 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 and destroy your enemy. And you're going through this galaxy, exploring these different star systems and working towards an end goal. The plan for this video is to do a general overview of some of the central themes and ideas behind the soundtrack, why I've decided to do the things that I'm doing. We only have about 10 minutes to do this video, so we're going to be pretty brief and also probably going to have to do a lot of editing. Now, looking at these different phases of the gameplay, I wanted to create very distinct and unique sounds for each of these phases to create an interesting push and pull. As you're exploring and traveling through this star system, I want you to be completely submerged and engulfed in the vastness, infinity of space. And that's why I decided to go with ambient music when it came to the star map view. To me, it's kind of what I would call hopeful, dark ambient, where I want to marry the infinite vastness of space with human hopes and human desires. Because in the game, you don't just have combat, you actually go into different events, and you're going to have to make some hard decisions about who lives, who dies, what happens to your crew. We also have a bunch of factions in the game, and your choices are going to influence the way these factions are going to see you, either as an enemy or an ally. Now, going into combat, the combat music is highly rhythmic. So here we're getting a very stark and distinct contrast between the star map music and the combat music. So when I first saw the game and started working on the music for it, I immediately had textures in my head, because the art style, the ship design, definitely borrows from realism, but the way it looks is kind of toyish in a certain way. And I wanted to marry the two together and represent that in the sonic realm. Now, when it came to the realism part of this equation, the choice was epic orchestral percussion. And I wanted it to be heavy and hard hitting so that you feel like you're in the midst of the fight and that you and your crew's life is at stake. The second element that we're using as a bridge to realism is orchestral strings. Now, these are extremely subtle. They're sort of shifting and moving there in the background, but it's still a sound that we recognize and associate to kind of a realistic cinematic landscape. But we're using these alternative articulations, which are kind of gnawing and swirling and shifting, but it also serves as a bridge. They sort of intertwine and enmesh with the synthetic elements. I also had a particular interest in exploring a lot of the sounds from trance music. So yes, the combat in Breachway can be pretty intense, but it can by no means be called trance music, but it's the sounds from that music that I have a particular interest in. And these would be sounds that I would hear every once in a while here and there in my childhood, whether it would be me sitting in the car waiting for my dad and finding a random radio station and watching out from the window, looking at the stars and hearing these very futuristic, technological, otherworldly sounding sounds. And these would also be sounds that you would hear in many video games from my childhood, you know, particularly around the early 2000s. I'm getting old. At the center of the sound for Breachway is synthesizers. It's here where I wanted to evoke some of that toy-like quality, some of that lightness, some of that naivety. And for me, it meant borrowing some of the tones and the qualities from a lot of these retro synth sounds. Now, Breachway is by no means going for that kind of a retro synthetic sound, but it's more of a head nod to those things. And in practice, it means that we're using very simple source sounds. So you do hear some simple waveforms, you do hear some of those bleepy, bloppy things, but that's pretty much where the similarities end, because we take those source sounds and we run them through a number of different processes. And those processes basically divide into two categories. In Breachway, we use a ton of arpeggiators, and arpeggiators tell the synthesizer to play notes in a certain pattern, in a certain rhythm. We use a lot of very dense and complex arpeggiator patterns overlapping with one another. And this isn't simply a productional choice, it's actually how I've written a lot of the music for Breachway. And a very beautiful thing happens when you're using those arpeggiators. Melodies and patterns begin to emerge out of that complexity. And I would hear bits and pieces that I would further like to explore. Many of these arpeggiators run in a randomized pattern. And I wanted to use this randomness as a compositional tool to evoke some of that sense of complex and futuristic technology. And it was important for me to represent that not only in terms of the sounds we use, the synthesized elements, but it also had to exist in the actual composition of the music, the actual notes that we're using. At the center of Breachway is this one cluster chord. That's basically the core compositional material. So basically you have the root note, you have the fifth, the third, and then the second and the fourth. Now this is stuff that I do use quite a bit in my compositions in general, but in Breachway I saw it as an absolute necessity, because with it we get complexity, we get a bit of mystery, and we certainly get a ton of tension. Now throughout the soundtrack, this is the essential core material for the composition, but we do move quite far out from it as well. It's by no means the only thing we're using. So we use variations of it, we use parts of it, we break it down, we move it around. We're not afraid to also explore a lot of different harmonies and melodies. Another very big compositional technique that I'm using throughout this music is actually effects processing. Now, usually we tend to think about these things in terms of their productional place and value, as well as how we use them when we're mixing music. But for me, effects were clearly a very distinct and important aspect of how I actually am going to compose this music. And really the two biggest effects that I'm using here are distortion and granular effects. And in short, depending on how the distortion is configured, it's going to respond to all of that rich, dense information coming from the arpeggiators, and it's going to chew on and respond to that in even further random and dense and rich, complex ways. And obviously, distortion gives us an edgy, aggressive sound that represents the conflict in these space combats. Now, in terms of granular synthesis, it's basically a device that takes in incoming audio and it slices it up into different chunks. Now, these chunks can be small, they can be big, and we can tell the granular effects unit to reorganize those chunks in pretty much any way we like, which we're using to evoke even a further sense of complexity, giving it this kind of a very otherworldly, techie, advanced sound. So that's the basic gist of it. If the game looks interesting to you, consider going on Steam and wishlisting it. If you want to follow the progress of the music more closely, you can follow me on any social that you wish, or you can go to my website and subscribe to my newsletter. If you want to check out my existing catalog of music, I've made a special discount code for just you, so use the code SAVEANDSOUND on Bandcamp to get 50% off anything, even the full discography, which is easily the cheapest way to get all of my music. That's it for this video. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time. Take care of yourself. Finished.